So the lawyers definitely would have kept it real with him and just said, hey, we believe we'll beat the sex trafficking charge. We believe we'll beat the racketeering charge. But when it comes to these transportation for the purpose of prostitution, there just is no beating these, right? You clearly had sex workers flying from out of state to wherever you were and engaged in commercial sex acts. And so we're going to lose on those. All right. So there's obviously been a verdict in the Diddy case. And that's something that I want to talk about. I know it's been a couple of weeks since that verdict came down, but I'm not a journalist or a reporter. I'm a criminal defense attorney. And so this isn't breaking news, but it's definitely something that I wanted to talk about because, obviously this case had a lot of attention just given the fame of Diddy and how big he is as a music legend, as a legendary business person. And oftentimes these stories are just, bigger. This was a story that was even bigger than hip hop. This was, I would say on that almost OJ level type of thing where you had somebody who was facing life in prison for racketeering and sex trafficking and the like. There were some, complex legal issues and things like that. And it just is something that had the attention of a lot of folks, or a lot of podcasts initiated, programs that were just dedicated to this case. So this was a really big deal. But before I get into it, just understand this was a monumental victory for the defense. I understand that he got convicted, and we'll talk a little bit about that a little later on, but this was absolutely a victory for the defense. I want to get into some of these issues. If you haven't watched any of my videos, my name is Jamahl Kersey. I am a criminal defense attorney. I've been practicing law for over 15 years, and on this channel, we're breaking down legal concepts so you are in the know. So a line that sticks out is, tell me, is we trafficking or tricking? Somebody's got to show me the difference. And if you're a hip hop head, you better know where that line is from. If you don't, it's off the new album from the Clips. It's from Inglorious Bastards. The whole album is phenomenal. It's amazing. I was just telling some of my boys in the group chat, I just love how, because Raekwon just dropped an album as well. I really love how they're making music for us, for the old heads, not worried about any of the youngins and just staying in their lane, being true to themselves. And, if it's for you, if it's for you, if it's for you, it's for you. If it's not, it's not. I really like embracing your own as an artist. But the reason why I'm citing the Clips is, again, that line is on point, and some of these legal issues that came up in the case, which is really cool because I was a literature major, right? And one of my favorite professors, he used to always say that art is the mirror of history, right? And actually that literature is the mirror of history. And really you could say all art is. And this is something that, say 50 years from now, 100 years from now, it'll be something that they can tie to Diddy's trial, because this is something where if you're not sure what tricking is, it's when you're spending money on a girl, not necessarily doing anything illegal or anything like that, but you're dropping money on elaborate dates, or maybe buying bags and doing all that stuff. Okay, so where is the line drawn between doing that? Maybe you're paying for a woman's rent, or buying bags, shopping trips and all that kind of stuff, and sex trafficking. And I think the government really blurred the lines here, and that was just a very clever way to address the legal issue that had everybody scratching their heads in this case. But the other parallel that I want to draw in terms of talking about the Clips, which again, let God sort them out. If you haven't listened to that album, you need to. I don't even know how many times I've run that album, over and over again. It's definitely one of those where, you have to give it multiple listens just to be able to break down and appreciate Pharrell's production, which he, I saw a little short video where he was talking about the production is so clean, so immaculate, you could eat off of it. And it's like, man, he really, he just really put his whole foot in that production. It's also, a big statement because obviously him and Chad have since split up in terms of the Neptunes. And so to the extent anyone had any questions of whether Pharrell could do it on his own, those doubts are definitely resolved. But the production was amazing. You had to listen to it for the production. And then just the clips just so crisp with their raps. I think Pusha T's 48, Malice is 52. You're not supposed to be able to rap like that at 52. And this dude, he took some breaks off. I know he had some solo projects and everything, when he revamped as No Malice, but now he's back to Malice. And for him to just come back and never even miss a step is just so impressive. But the reason why I'm bringing up the clips, besides the lyric that was completely on point, is the parallel between trial lawyers and rappers, right? We are both a very competitive group, right? We're a very competitive group. Trial lawyers, when we take on a case, and even prosecutors, they're fighting to win. We are in this to win. Nobody goes to trial on a case wanting to or expecting to lose, right? And rappers are obviously competitive. You have rap beefs and you have, top 5, top 10 lists that get tossed around in barbershops and, everywhere, schoolyards and the like. And, everybody wants to be number one and everybody thinks they're the best. But preparation and effort are both very apparent when you get into the courtroom and when you get into the booth or when you put out art for the world to see. I love Lil Wayne, and I'm sure if you're watching this, you do too. But unfortunately, even his biggest fans were like, man, this ain't it, right? And I don't know if, it's whatever was going on with Cash Money and Birdman and everybody, or he just kind of put some stuff together, but it really, it just didn't meet his level of excellence that was established by the rest of the Carter series. Whereas this one, and I don't know how much time he put into this, but Clips have been on a crazy press run, and they mentioned they spent 2 years on this album, and that is completely apparent. It is very obvious that they spent a lot of time meticulously writing their rhymes, in the beat selection and everything, and it ends up paying off. It absolutely does. And they deserve all of the accolades and flowers that are coming to them. It's very akin to Killer Mike's effort. He put out an album, was that last year? Or I think it was either last year or 2023 when he put out Michael. And he talked about, hey, listen, I had to have a conversation with my wife and tell her, listen, we're going to invest in this album. And, and it was a significant amount, multiple 6 figures that he invested into this album, and it paid off. You could tell the level of effort that he put into his raps. And again, the clips, you can tell the level of effort they put into it. And I don't know how much it costs to have Pharrell produce your whole album. And I know obviously there's that VA connection between Pharrell and the Clips, and so there's probably some little homie rate in there somewhere, but it could not have been cheap. But again, it is absolutely worth it. And same thing from a trial lawyer's perspective. A jury, the judge, your opposing counsel, everybody knows in the room, the bailiffs, they know if you are not prepared. And so you better take the time. You better have taken the weeks leading up to trial, the hours up to trial, where you're just putting in the time and knowing the case like the back of your hand and being prepared, because you do not want to waste anybody's time, right? And the same thing, in art, you don't want to have somebody sit through a 45-hour-minute album and you're not talking about anything. You didn't put any effort into it. It's not good, because people are just going to hit the stop button and go on to the next thing. And same thing when it comes to trying a case, you want to make sure that you are respecting the jury's time, because listen, especially in these marathon trials where you have multiple weeks or even months, people are taking time away from the things that they love. They're taking time away from work. It could be a financial hardship for some people. And for you to not respect their time, there's just no room for not being prepared. So the competitive nature of hip hop and being a trial lawyer and the effort being absolutely apparent, knowing the ins and outs of your case are parallels that I draw between the two. And the other thing is just the longer you do it, the better you get, right? And so in hip hop, there's this whole thing about, being young or being youthful. And, being youthful has its advantages, but these two gentlemen put together an album that they could not have made when they're in their 20s, right? They're at a level of life, of maturity, of experiences having lived that they could not reproduce back then. They had to go through everything that they went through in order to make the album that they made, including, but not limited to, the opening track, right? Where they're getting extremely vulnerable in having conversations with their mom and dad, by way of Pusha T and then Malice respectively. And man, and that was a very, very, very emotional track. Fire, hits you all in the feels. But yeah, same thing with being a trial lawyer. The longer you do it, right? The longer you do it well and you're performing at a high level, the better you get, right? I am a much better trial lawyer now, over 15 years in than I was in year one, even though I feel like I had pretty solid skills from the beginning because of, some of the work that I did and things like that. But there's no question. There's a level of confidence. There's a level of security. There's a level of just skill development from going through the fire so many times, right? If you've represented multiple people facing life in prison, there's just a level of experience you bring to the table. And the analogy even goes to sports. If you remember, Canelo Alvarez is now, one of the biggest boxers in the sport, if not the biggest. And there was a time when he was early on in his career and he faced Mayweather, and he was younger, and Mayweather was obviously the more experienced boxer. And Mayweather even mentioned, like, hey, it's different when you're under those bright lights. And it absolutely is. And, as talented as he was coming up, Canelo just was not ready. And now you see him as the elder statesman in the sport, showing some of these younger cats what's up. The other thing is, just investing in quality folks and having quality people in your camp. To kind of go to the Diddy trial, he obviously had a star-studded, lineup in terms of his defense attorneys. Probably spent a lot of money, if not, millions of dollars on his defense. And, you need to have a team, right? This is not just a one-person show. A lot of times when I'm in trial, I'm sitting next to my client and it's just me and them in the room, in the courtroom. But, what you don't see is all the work, our law clerk does, all the work our paralegal does, all the work our investigator does, all the work my assistant does, all the work everybody else on the team. When I'm in the courtroom, you see that, but it's the collective effort of everybody in the firm that puts us in a position to, put on the performance that we do in trial. And so, interestingly enough, while Diddy's trial was going on, I was in trial myself. So I was in trial on an attempted murder case. This was a shooting, and we're still pending sentencing. But similarly to Diddy, my client was facing life in prison as well, right? Because it was an attempted murder, allegedly, and it was premeditated. My client was facing life. And our position from the beginning was that this was not an attempted murder. None of us were on the defense side saying that he should just get off scot-free and there should be no penalty or punishment, but it was an attempted murder. And the prosecutor was adamant that it was attempted murder, right? So we have two different theories of what ultimately happened in the case. And one of the things that I tend to mention in my closing arguments in front of a jury, I always thank the jury because I am very much appreciative of their time, but I mention the fact that the jury is so important because they are the one thing. They're the one thing that is standing in the way or standing in between the government saying you did this, right? And you are going to be punished for this, right? Because any case that goes to trial, generally speaking, the prosecutor believes either that your client did what he's being charged with, or that he's pretty confident that he or she can prove that case beyond a reasonable doubt. And so you have a prosecutor who is saying, no, your client absolutely did this. I'm going to prove it to a jury, and then your client's going to be punished for it. So in my particular case, the prosecutor was adamant. We had multiple conversations where he's saying your client, acted with intent to kill, and he's going to be found guilty of attempted murder. And, in their PowerPoints, and they're putting in bold red letters, he's guilty, convict this man. Obviously in the federal trials, you don't get the live streaming. They don't allow cameras in the courtroom. And that's why, we didn't get to really see any of the trial. You get the ugly courtroom sketches and commentary from people who were, in the trial, but we just don't get any of that information. And so, I didn't really see much of anything about this trial, just kind of knowing the bigger picture issues. But the thing is, what I do know is the government was adamant that Diddy was sex trafficking, that he was committing racketeering, right? And those were the major, counts in this case, and what caused him to be in a position where he was facing life in prison, right? And in the end, this turned out to be an absolute victory for the defense, and I think, quite frankly, an embarrassment, a total embarrassment for the prosecution. If you go back to last year, right, after the news broke on Kersey's whole situation, and I want to say that news broke about the settlement, and then the government rolls out their whole thing. They have a press conference, and even before that, you had these big government raids, right? And everyone was like, oh man, Diddy's done. If you have the feds coming down on both your properties, because Diddy have one in LA and Miami, or LA and New York, wherever the feds ran up in his properties, and they're getting guns and baby oil and all this kind of stuff. And we made a big deal about this baby oil, and Diddy's done because of the baby oil, right? The press conference, if you watched that press conference, you'd have every reason to believe that the prosecution was going to be able to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. The interesting thing is, when you hear about federal cases and you hear about their success rate, right? The feds are 98% success rate when they go to trial. And, the reality is there is a difference. There's an appreciable difference between the way the feds work up a case and the way the state works up the case. The feds have a lot more resources, right? We're talking about the federal government versus a state government, but that statistic is a thing, right? And it can scare folks into taking a deal where they otherwise say, hey, I'm innocent, or I'm not guilty, or they wouldn't be able to prove the case. The Fed's success rate can be an influential factor in terms of a person deciding to take their case to trial or not, just out of the fear of, man, if I go to trial, I'm going to be convicted. Look at this success rate. Every case has to be evaluated on its own merits, right? You can't just rely on statistics to determine how a case is ultimately going to turn out. The government, ultimately, they have to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt in front of a jury, and they have to unanimously find the defendant in a criminal case guilty. That federal success rate can scare folks. The amount of time can scare folks, right? If you're facing life in prison, that is a monumental life decision that you have to make to decide to take your case to trial. You obviously have to have all the faith in the world in your defense counsel, right? You have to have the confidence that he or she is going to, do what they need to do in order to clear your name if you believe that you didn't do it, right? Or you didn't actually do it. And that's, the situation with Diddy, right? He was facing life in prison. He's placed his faith and trust and confidence in the hands of Agnifilo and Garagos, and brought in Brian Steele and whomever else was on that case. And interestingly enough, he had that defense attorney who was on the case, and then decided that due to ethical reasons, he needed to get off the case. And even that sparked speculation. Oh, what does that mean? Does he believe that, Puff is guilty and now he can't stay on the case? Ultimately, obviously things turned out in his favor, but those are the things that have people speculating. And the interesting thing is just how much information is available to the public these days, right? Before this case even got to trial, we knew so much about this case, right? They tried to keep, the names anonymous. Obviously, we knew about Cassie. I think Daphne Joy or Daphne J, whatever her name is. Folks may not have known who that was going to be. That caused some surprises, it seems, in this case. But we are just so privy to so much information, so much more than even 5-10 years ago in the legal space. And I think that was another big thing in Jonathan Major's case, right, where we saw videos and text messages and all this kind of stuff long before the case got to the courtroom, and that can play to a defense's favor, and it could also cut against you. But the major issues in this case were, again, whether Puff was sex trafficking, and was he engaged in racketeering? Was he running a criminal enterprise? And there is actually a really good documentary on Netflix. It's called El Portal, which is spelled like the portal, the portal, right? And it's about sex trafficking. And if you have any doubt or you're unclear on what sex trafficking is, watch that documentary and you will see what sex trafficking actually is. If you don't want to take the time, I'll break it down for you. Basically, there was this website in Mexico City where you could look up escorts. All right, they had different pictures of a bunch of different women in lingerie and their stats and things like that. And you could, click and then make your arrangements to meet with these escorts, right? And then obviously whatever happened at that point. The women, in order to make their way on this website, some of them were recruited and knew exactly what it was that they were getting into, right? So you are going to be an escort, and there may or may not be extracurricular activities, right, during your dates. But these women knew what they were getting into. However, there were also women who did not know what they were getting into, right? So they thought that they were applying for I was going to say a legitimate job, but another type of employment, right? Whether it was going to be like a nanny or, cleaning houses or whatever the job post or description was. They would be flown into Mexico from, their South American country that they were from. They flew into Mexico. They would have to give up their passport, right? So they couldn't travel. It also, obviously, it costs money for the flight. It costs money to handle the immigration paperwork, and it costs money for the lodging. So by the time these women got to Mexico City, they were already in the hole. They had a debt that they had to pay off. And again, the people were holding on to their passports. So even if they wanted to leave, they couldn't leave. It turns out that they were there to become escorts, right? So they had to get all, dolled up and do photo shoots and be promoted and all this kind of stuff. So some of these women had no idea what they were getting into. They were all kept in an apartment or a condo. All these women lived together, and they would get booked for their dates and all of that. And so they would get a cut of what they were being paid for their services. And then things had, and don't get me wrong, some of these women seemed all about the life, right? They liked the fast money. I definitely won't call it easy money. They liked the fast money. They liked the lifestyle. They liked the, getting all dolled up and glamorous and having, sort of like penthouse type photo shoots and things like that. And, being able to spend money and get clothes and do all these things would be exciting. But then there was also a darker side when people wanted to see if they could go out on their own and start their own little businesses and get their own little, women under them and things like that. That's when things would get violent. And the owners of this business, they were very controlling of these women. They would control their situation financially. They tracked their movements, right? So anywhere they went, there were eyes in the city who knew where they were at any time. They controlled the money. They used violence or threats of violence to make sure that they continued to fall in line and do what was expected of them. And if they did try and branch out and start their own thing, then there was violence exacted upon them. And there were examples of women who got killed after numerous threats, going up against the system. Without going, deeper into it, that is sex trafficking. Recruiting, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or solicitation of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. That is a mouthful, but if we kind of break this thing down and talk about commercial sex acts, and this is even where this was just weird in this case, in that in the example that I just gave, there are, arguably commercial sex acts going on between these different Johns and these sex workers, right? So, the Johns are paying money, the sex workers or the escorts are giving their time and services, right? And so that would be a commercial sex act. A commercial sex act is a sexual act that has a commercial element to it. So there's an exchange, right? There's a trade of money or, goods or other services, resources versus just a simple, sex act, which wouldn't have a commercial element to it. But in Diddy's case, the interesting sort of, I think, mental gymnastics that the government had to go through in order to accuse him of sex trafficking is that there were sex workers obviously being flown in out of state wherever, he was. All right, I'm in Miami. I'm flying in folks from New York, or I'm in New York. I'm flying folks in from Miami or from LA. Those were commercial sex acts in that Puff was paying these sex workers in order to have sex, but in order to have sex with either Cassie or Daphne, right? But they weren't accusing him of trafficking as it related to the sex workers, but rather trafficking as it related to Cassie and Daphne. And this is where, it just was weird because they tried to make it sound as though these two women were, forced into, again, these commercial sex acts by force, fraud, or coercion. And if you remember, if you saw my video where I was talking about how the defense's position is that Puff is innocent because when these Freakoff tapes were going to be played, there wasn't going to be any evidence whatsoever that this was under, that they were doing this under duress or that they were forced to do it or, there was some sort of fraud going on or they were being coerced into doing it. These women were going to appear to be, essentially having the time of their lives or at least really enjoying sex with these prostitutes that were being brought in, right? And ultimately, the jury had to have believed that everything was consensual, just as the defense was arguing. It's simply not a crime to be a freak. It's not a crime to have freaky sexual tendencies. And, we actually learned way more about Puff's sex life than we probably ever cared to know or but that's kind of the nature of these cases. And I definitely want to talk about the tape, right? The notorious tape that was released and CNN, and just the impact that had. But ultimately, I didn't see the sex trafficking here. I think that from everything that I saw, both of these women were willing participants in their relationships with Puff, or whatever their situationship was, right? But they weren't being forced to participate in these freak-offs. And it's interesting. There was a juror who was interviewed. He said, "Hey, we watched these videos, and the content was pretty tame, right? So it was relatively vanilla. So you saw, obviously people engaged in sexual activity, but there wasn't just this situation where these women were being forced into being there." And so in terms of the racketeering discussion, whether they could demonstrate that Puff was running a criminal enterprise, listen, these people were the people that work for him, whether they're security personnel or personal assistants, managers and things, these are people who had just regular 9-to-5 jobs, or 1099 employees, and they were doing legitimate work for legitimate companies, whether that was a marketing company, or you had the network doing the Revolt stuff, or whatever his company that was responsible for promoting the Ciroc and the music, obviously the Bad Boy label. These are all legitimate businesses. The fact that Puff has resources and may have, dabbled into some, criminal acts in terms of drug possession, having firearms and things like that, didn't convert these legitimate jobs and legitimate entities into criminal entities. I think this was just a blatant misuse of racketeering, right? And a racket is essentially a pattern and practice of criminal activity, in an organized fashion. And you can have all kinds of rackets. You could have a money laundering racket. You could have a sex trafficking racket. You can have a numbers racket, so doing like illegal lottery and gaming. You can have a drug racket. So there's all kinds of different, at its core, it is organized criminal activity, and it is a way to be able to go after the upper bosses who obviously don't have their hands in the day-to-day conduct of the conspiracy, right? So if you're selling drugs out in the streets, there are so many layers between the upper bosses and the people who are doing hand-to-hand deals in the streets. But if we can say that they're working under, this level of people, and this level of people are working under these captains who are, working under the, the bosses, whatever the, terminology is, they used the racketeering in order to take down the mafia, because again, these guys, were in suits, eating at grandma's diner every night, right? Or in a basement counting money, or whatever it was that they were doing, but they weren't in getting their hands dirty in the street. So the government needed to have a way to be able to prosecute people who didn't have their hands in the day-to-day operations. And this just was not that. This was the government, in my opinion, completely overplaying their hand. And that then, there's just not a whole lot more to say about it, other than this absolutely was not racketeering, right? You just had a very rich man who had resources, who was able to kind of leverage his workers to do, odd jobs, say, so to speak, for him. But that doesn't make them part of some sort of criminal conspiracy. I mean, it's just really hard to have a one-man racketeering situation. Getting to the video and the importance of it and the impact of it, the video was so monumental in that it turned a lot of people away from Puff, right? It had that effect because, we as a society, and, rightfully so, we're not prepared to just sign off on domestic violence. And Everything in that tape was absolutely horrendous and ugly. There's no justification for it. And don't get me wrong. As a defense attorney, you are not consenting to the conduct. You're not supporting the conduct. His lawyers weren't going into the jail and high-fiving him over the conduct. However, you are, in the business of defending your client. You're defending his constitutional rights. You're making sure he gets treated fairly within the system. And that's, that was something that they had to deal with. And the issue is that this was evidence of domestic violence. And I believe that took place at a hotel in LA. If he were prosecuted in the Los Angeles Superior Court, then he could have been charged with felony domestic violence. And it certainly would have been a felony versus a misdemeanor. And that would have been his charge. But it seemed the government tried to wedge this domestic violence situation into then saying that this is evidence of the sex trafficking. And that was just too great of a leap to make. And again, and a lot of people ended up having a newfound negative opinion of Puff based on the video. And I really can't fault folks for that, just because, again, it was so ugly. But domestic violence does not sex trafficking make. And, it seemed as though the government was trying to make the argument that, hey, look how, controlling and violent he is. That means that Cassie absolutely had to have been forced into doing what she was doing. But again, you could say, he's violent, and you could say whatever you want about his character, but that just simply didn't make him a sex trafficker. And that video was very powerful, and like I said, turned a lot of people who had either supported him in the beginning or even fans, turned them against him. And so you had this danger of him being convicted in the court of public opinion long before he was actually in the criminal court. But if you looked at the video for what it was, and being a domestic violence situation, that and sex trafficking are two completely different things. And if, and I understand the statute of limitations, that's where they would have had the issues. By the time this video surfaced, the statute of limitations likely would have long since run, and LA didn't prosecute him for it. So, that's where, he never got charged with domestic violence, but that would have been the more appropriate charge, where that video, would have been evidence. But, the reality is, again, Cassie, she enjoyed these freak-offs. There was evidence that ended up coming out that she was booking some of them herself. And there were text messages saying how, she wanted to have the next freak-off and she loved the freak-offs, right? So that was evidence, because again, the prosecution they have the burden of proof, right? The defense does not have to prove anything at all. So I saw that there was reactions from some people like, oh, Diddy's not calling any witnesses, or Diddy's not taking the stand. That must mean that, they already know they're losing. No, the defense doesn't have the burden of proving anything. A lot of times, either, the defense attorney or a prosecutor will mention it in jury selection and say, hey, listen, the defense can decide to call no witnesses. The defendant doesn't have to take the stand, and you're not allowed to hold it against him if he doesn't take the stand. In fact, the defense attorney, he's not going to do it, but they'll oftentimes say the defense attorney could ask no questions, make no argument, and the prosecution would still have the burden of demonstrating to the jury beyond a reasonable doubt that the person did what they're alleged to have done. And so, I think that their case was built on the cross-examination of these witnesses, and they felt at the end of the day, hey, we don't really need to put on a case because we've already demonstrated, we've already drawn out reasonable doubt based on our cross-examinations. And that was, you could say it's a bold move, but it was one that ultimately, played out in their favor. I think it would have been a difficult challenge putting Puff on the stand. I personally, and you have different trains of thought as it relates to putting clients on the stand. Some people say don't put your client on unless you have to. I'm under the belief of, put your client on unless you can't, right? And why wouldn't you be able to? If you have a client who's just an extreme hothead, if they're volatile, if they can't get out of their own way, if they're just going to be, they're going to be easily triggered by a prosecutor who's, poking buttons and things like that. If you just can't trust your client on the stand, you may want to elect not to put them on. But through preparation, I love to see, if I can get them on the stand, then I like to put them on the stand. But obviously they elected not to put Puff on, and ultimately they didn't need to put him on, right? They had the defense established by way of the cross-examination. One of the interesting things, obviously, with the verdict coming down the way it did, is the defense requested that he be released on bail. And I think that's a natural request, right? His exposure initially, going into the trial, was life in prison. And so the judge, the judge takes that into consideration, the seriousness of the offense, danger to the community at large, danger to potential witnesses, the alleged victims, and things like that. And risk of flight, right? And if you are facing life in prison, then the risk of flight becomes, almost inherent, right? You'd rather skip town and take off to another country rather than to risk sticking around for trial and facing life in prison. But he's beat the life charges, right? He's certainly still facing a significant amount of time, but he's beat the life charges. And so you might think that, hey, he should have been able to get out of custody. The judge denied it based on his lawyer's own concession that he's a violent person, right? Because again, they couldn't argue that what had happened in the video didn't happen, right? You are clearly, committing assault and battery on a person in a video, right? So, the judge didn't have a hard time making findings that he's violent and there may be a risk to folks if he gets out of custody. And so obviously he was denied bail. But now, and that speaks to the point of saving credibility in front of a judge, saving credibility in front of a jury. If they tried to somehow argue that he's not a violent person, or doesn't have violent tendencies, then you lose credibility. And part of their defense ultimately in this case was, hey, you may find him to be an ugly, despicable person, but that doesn't make him a sex trafficker. That doesn't mean he was running a criminal enterprise, right? And so juries tend to be drawn in or gravitate towards an attorney who is willing to concede on points that absolutely should be conceded. And so I thought that was masterful use of the facts in order to sort of, draw, to make the admission, hey, our guy did these things and that's really bad. But when it comes to what the government is trying to paint him as, we don't have that here. Right. And so, it looks like he is facing now at this point 10 years on either of the counts, because he was ultimately convicted of transportation for the purpose of prostitution, right? Typically, when it comes to prostitution, there's not going to be, crossing of state lines, right? If somebody is on some sort of website or even, goes to the Blade, right, where the, sex workers are hanging out and they go and proposition that woman and do what they do, there's no crossing of state lines involved, right? You're in the same town, you're not even going to another town, or crossing town lines, right? You're within the same city. In this situation, if you have, if you have a sex worker and you're moving them from one state to another state for the purpose of engaging in prostitution, then that is a violation of the Mann Act. The defense attorneys, obviously, they're going to have had conversations with Puff. If they were being, honest with them, and I have no reason to believe that they wouldn't be, then they would be conceding, hey, listen, we're not going to, win on these charges, right? You are going to be found guilty on these charges. So the lawyers definitely would have kept it real with them and just said, hey, we believe we'll beat the sex trafficking charge. We believe we'll beat the racketeering charge. But when it comes to these transportation for the purpose of prostitution, there just is no beating these, right? You clearly had sex workers flying from out of state to wherever you were and engaged in commercial sex acts. And so we're going to lose on those. And, but in the grand scheme of things, again, there would be no expectations otherwise. There would be no delusions that he was going to beat those charges. But when it came to the sex trafficking and the racketeering, that's where I say that this was a monumental, victory for the defense. And they have all the reason in the world to celebrate what they were able to accomplish in this case. And shout out to the jury too, right? Sitting through, a couple months worth of testimony, thousands of exhibits, and ultimately getting it right. I just love to see, when a jury comes back with a not guilty verdict, and not just for somebody getting off, but because the jury ultimately said, hey, listen, Mr. Prosecutor, United States of America, you didn't prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. We simply weren't convinced beyond a reasonable doubt, that the person was guilty. And they say, as part of the jury's instructions, at least in California, that proof beyond a reasonable doubt leaves you with an abiding conviction that the charge is true. And I often say in my closing arguments that, an abiding conviction, those are powerful words, such that, a day later, 2 months later, a year from now, if you are asked or you ask yourself about whether you were convinced that the prosecutor proved their case, then you ultimately knew in your heart, that they proved that case beyond a reasonable doubt. And so ultimately, with the jury making the decision that they did, voting not guilty, they demonstrated that they did not believe that the prosecution proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And that is the system working the way it's supposed to. And I know people have been so divided in terms of how they feel about the verdict, thinking that it is, an indictment on our system in terms of how we treat victims, right? Victims or survivors of domestic violence. And it's not that. You have to really be able to look at this case for what it was and be able to say, hey, listen, and it's no fault of the government as it relates to the domestic violence situation. Again, domestic violence charges are typically, filed locally. Like you're generally not going to have a federal domestic violence case unless it's a domestic violence situation that happens, aboard an airplane or on, federal land or, a military base, something like that. In that situation, then, it can be federal, but every other domestic violence case is going to be a local issue. But again, whether, I don't know how this came about that the federal government decided they were going to jump on this after, the news broke about the settlement. But it just really seems to be an overplaying of their hand, a misuse of resources. And ultimately, I'm just glad that the jury got this thing right. And so in terms of the time, facing 10 years and 10 years on both of the counts, I just don't see this case being worth 20 years. Once you've been practicing for a while, you're able to understand, essentially what cases are quote unquote worth, right? And, for him to be, that would be the absolute worst case scenario. And oftentimes we'll tell clients the worst case scenario almost never happens. And obviously we're not shooting for the worst case scenario. The client should know what their exposure is and know what the worst case scenario is. But, also understand that, we're seeking to do way better than the worst case scenario. And just in general, the worst case scenario almost never happens. I imagine the defense will be asking for time served, if not, a couple of years in prison, wanting him to get out as soon as possible. It seems like they're trying to advance the sentencing hearing to put it in front of the judge. I think that sentencing is scheduled for October. And we'll see how the judge comes down. I haven't seen any indication in terms of what the government is going to be asking for, but in terms of transportation for the purpose of prostitution. Again, these all being, willing participants. And yes, it's a crime. But it's a violation of federal law, but it's certainly not the crime of the century. He has no criminal history. There's going to be a lot of mitigating information that they're going to be able to put on. And I just think that they're going to make the request for time served at this point. I mean, he did have to sit down for well over a year, lost his life as he knew it for well over a year. And I just think that should be found to be sufficient in order to, punish him for his conduct in this case. But we'll see how that plays out. But yeah, I just felt like, with this case, there were some thoughts that I had to get out. I wanted to get this shot. This has gone way longer than I thought it would. But let me know if you have any questions, comments, concerns. How did you see this case playing out? Did you know it was going to go down this way? Do you agree with the verdict or do you disagree? And how much time do you think he should get? All right, so if you got something out of this, show me some love, hit the like button, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications so you never miss a new video when it drops. As always, I want to thank you so much for watching, and until next time, peace.